found inside of Fort Ancient, which was built by the Hopewell. The last here we'll say from about 1600 to 1673, that's the late prehistoric or the early proto-historic tribes in the state of Ohio. And we'll not talk about any of those, but every single culture that I mentioned up here left their stuff here at Serpent Mound, going all the way back to the Paleolithic. Serpent Mound has had occupation here, where people coming through here and leaving stuff behind for at least that length of time. So here's a good picture of Serpent Mound, straight overhead picture. The latest systematic carbon dating project was done. It was known as the Serpent Mound Project, organized by the archaeologist William Romaine. He drilled a series of cores through the whole length of Serpent Mound, starting about right here, going up and down the entire body. I think they did 22 cores. They laid them out, took them to Indiana University, laid them out and analyzed the layers of soil, got a soil profile of the serpent. And in 7 of those cores, the very bottom layer where the mound is constructed on the original ground, they could tell that based on the layer of soil, they found some carbon to be dated. All 7 of the carbon dates came back with a median date of 321 BC. That puts that in the Adena time frame. So it appears, for all intents and purposes, that when you read much of the signage out here that says that it's built by the Fort Ancient, that doesn't appear to be the case. I will say, though, that although Romaine's project identified that Adena was the likely construction time frame for Serpent Mound, I did a project where I went and looked at all of the artifacts that were excavated here by the Harvard Peabody Museum. They excavated here from 1886 to 1889, and they collected hundreds and hundreds of artifacts. And I went through systematically, and we looked at every single artifact. 40% of all of the lithic artifacts, not the non-pottery stuff, 40% of them were from the Archaic, not from Adena. There was lots of Adena stuff, but the overwhelming majority was from the Archaic. Now, Serpent Mound is a pretty sizable earthwork, and it's an animal effigy, but it's just one of a number. I did a project earlier this year. I gave a presentation here at Serpent Mound during the summer solstice about all of the serpent effigies of North America. I was able to map out and document more than 95 different serpent effigies, either of earth or of stone, across the country. And we'll show you a map here in a moment. Yeah, here we go. So here we are right here. There's Serpent Mound. All these little green serpents are the earthen serpents. All of the gray ones are stone serpents. And these brown ones here are what's known as intaglios, which are the reverse of an earthwork. Instead of building an earthwork up, they cut the shape into the ground, and they call that an intaglio. And so there's a couple of those serpents out in Kansas. Many of them have astronomical alignments like what I'm going to describe tonight. Many of the construction techniques and alignments are similar to what we see at Serpent Mound. Anybody here from out of Ohio? Couple people. You may recognize your state up here. The numbers after the state are the numbers of serpent effigies in any particular state. Ohio had 7, by the way. There's 7 documented serpent effigies in Ohio. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Archeo-Astronomy. Astronomy is the study of the sky, and it's kind of an umbrella term. Today, we use the term astronomy to describe all kinds of things like, space exploration, and it's not just people looking through telescopes anymore looking at the stars. It encompasses a whole wide range of stuff. Well, archaeoastronomy has kind of become a subset of that. Is how can we study how people studied the stars in the past? Well, we can do that archaeologically by understanding if there is a relationship between that archaeological site and the sky. And so in the 1980s, early 1980s, there were two major conferences in the scientific community. They became known as the Oxford Conferences that really organized the discipline of archaeoastronomy. One, they issued a book and it had a green cover, and so that has become known as green archaeoastronomy, and it's called Archaeoastronomy in the Old World, meaning Europe mostly. And then there was the brown-covered book, which became the Archaeoastronomy of the New World, which was here in North America and South America. And the approaches between the two academic groups are very different. The Archaeoastronomy of the Old World, that was very much based on statistics, horizon-based astronomy, so where does the sun come up as it rises above the horizon? Sun and moon, mostly. They had to use those kinds of methodologies because ancient evidence of social structures are very rare in the old world. Those, the cultures have reoccupied sites over and over again, and there really are indigenous peoples that are still holding on to their indigenous knowledge any longer. And so they can identify likely interest by prehistoric peoples in the sky, but they can't answer why they were doing it. Now, the approach in the New World has been largely on historical and ethnographic data from Native American tribes or First Peoples nations in Canada or indigenous tribes in South America, and they were more focused on alignments of the sun and moon and planets with the prehistoric architecture, and they have a better handle on why, because they're using that ethnographic data. But in many cases, their arguments are more statistically weak. So you have give and take. Now, in 1987, that was kind of a breakthrough watershed year for archaeoastronomy at Serpent Mound, because the archaeologist William Romaine, who I mentioned before, doing that Serpent Mound project, way back in the 1980s, he was focused on the archaeoastronomy of the site. And it took him a while, but he finally figured out where true north-south was here. For those that don't know, we are here inside of a meteor crater. If everybody turns around and looks that direction to the south, you'll see a ridge in the distance. That ridge is the rim of the meteor crater that we're inside of. The meteor crater is about 5 miles in diameter and was formed about 200 million years ago. It has a federal designation. It's known as the Serpent Mound Crypto-Explosive Area Natural National Landmark. And it was designated as such in 1980. If anybody wants to see that federal plaque, it's not here. It is on the other side of the crater at a place called Woodland Altars on Route 41. It's over by the end of the parking lot. Why it's over there, I have no idea, but that's also in the crater there. And because the crater was formed here, it fractured the rock and left all kinds of faults, and it created some really unusual magnetic changes in the crater. So compasses tend to not work exactly right, and there are gravitational anomalies as well as electromagnetic field anomalies. That's not really a part of this talk. That's a separate talk. Come back for Geology Day, and you can hear that. But Romaine, it took him a while to figure out the exact true north line. He actually had to come out at night and do observations of Polaris, the North Star, to kind of figure that out. And here's what he found. Whoops. That's the alignment that he found, was from the center of the tail through this little notch in the back of the head. That's the true north line. It's actually, there's another parallel line right here that kind of parallels these parts of the body, and same thing with here. And once they found the true north line, they were able to then understand a lot of the rest of the astronomical alignments. And Romaine really did the yeoman's work on this. But he did that work in the mid-1980s. I want to take you back farther than that. How many people are here with the Boy Scouts? Okay. So I can't, this was an article that we dug up earlier this year, I believe. This is dated August 17th, 1929, from the Hamilton Evening Journal. Boy Scouts of Hamilton, Colonel J.R. Robertson, Scout Executive, wrote this story about boys on trips see sights of Indian mounds. And they took a trip, Troop 7, they took them out to see Serpent Mound, and then they went to see Sight Mound and some other mounds in the area. And there's a little paragraph right here, which I'll blow up. It says here, the head of the serpent, whether by accident of contour or by design, points directly to the setting sun at the summer equinox. Now, there's no such thing as the summer equinox. It's called the summer solstice, but he's close. They're appearing to identify the very first astronomical alignment that was found here at Serpent Mound. But that really wasn't found or documented, at least, until the early 1980s. And so the Boy Scouts may have at least documented that astronomical alignment going all the way back to the 1920s. Now, in the preceding paragraph, it does talk about how they met and talked with a number of scholars and academics who were at the park when they arrived. And it may be that they got that information from that group, but we don't know. They don't say that they made the observations themselves, but at least they reported it. All right? So we'll talk about that astronomical alignment here on the next slide. So this here is a LiDAR image of Serpent Mound. For those that don't understand or haven't heard of what LiDAR is, it's basically light infrared, and you fly over in a plane and you send that light infrared beam down to the ground, and it reflects back up to some sensors on the plane, and it gives you latitude, longitude, elevation above sea level, tells you what it reflected off of, whether it was off of grass or concrete or a building or whatever. And you can take those data points and you can create a three-dimensional map. I was the first one to do that here in the state of Ohio. I was the first one to use it for archaeological purposes. But the data was actually collected by the Ohio Department of Transportation. So how many people are here from Ohio? Your tax money at work. Okay? The Ohio Department of Transportation wanted to map all the state highways. And I heard about the project and said, you know what, if they're going to map the state highways, they might inadvertently capture some archaeological sites that are near state highways. Ohio State Route 73 is right down there. So it turns out that they did. And so I was able to reconstruct this. My background, when I was at Eastern Michigan University, my master's thesis was on a NASA grant. I mapped data on the surface of the moon from the Lunar Prospector mission, so I had a background in remote sensing. And so I did that. And this is made up of, you can see down here, 223,000 data points. That's how many reflections were reflected back up to the sensor, so that we are pretty accurate to within about 3 or 4 centimeters. You can see the asphalt pathway around Serpent Mound right there. Right. So this is about as good as it gets in terms of mapping. They've improved LiDAR a little bit, and so there's like a new generation of LiDAR that's coming out, but it's really not going to get much better than this. There's Romaine's true north line. All right, and what I'm going to show you here is that is the summer solstice sunset, and here's all the other solar alignments at the site. All right. So what we have here is this summer solstice sunset line goes from that true north intersect point along the back of the head, through the oval, and then onto the horizon. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. But that was the very first alignment that was documented here at Serpent Mound, whether you can give the credit to the Boy Scouts or you can give the credit to a pair of people in the early 1980s by the name of Clark and Marjorie Hardiman. They were the first ones to document the solar alignment here, and they aren't really given too much credit for doing so by the archaeological community because they weren't archaeologists either. What they were dowsers. That's like, scientific community hates that term, right? But it was the dowsers that found this, and they identified it. In fact, the guy, Clark Hardiman, had actually identified a number of astronomical alignments at a site in Florida where he lived. It was known as the Crystal River Earthworks site in Florida. And he identified several astronomical alignments there through his dowsing work, and then he decided to come here and apply that methodology that he learned there, and he discovered that. The summer solstice sunrise, the equinox sunrise, and the winter solstice sunrise, those were all identified. I should probably pull this up. Those were identified by Robert Fletcher and Terry Cameron. They did a project also in the mid-1980s, about the time that Romain was here doing his work, after the Hardimans were here, and they identified those alignments. Now, a few years ago, I talked with Terry Cameron about this and asked him, well, how come you didn't find the alignments to the sunsets? You only did the sunrises. And he said, well, because we couldn't see through the trees well enough. So I came out here and I did it, and I managed to document those. I confirmed all of the sunset alignments, which were calculated based on Romain's work. And then we went out and confirmed them. The most recent finding was this one right here, which is a winter solstice sunset line that goes through the coil of spiral of the tail. And that was just a couple of years ago, 2014. So that's the most recent one that's been uncovered. There are 2 summer solstice sunset alignments, one through this coil and one through the oval. There are 2 winter solstice sunset alignments, one through this coil and one through the tail. Now, for those that try to visualize this in your head, we're kind of looking at this from an overhead angle, right? But if we wanted to look at it from a ground angle, this is a good graphic that I picked up from University of Massachusetts. So if you stand in the center and you look east or south or north or west, this is the directions that you can expect to see the winter solstice sunset, for instance, along this alignment, or the winter solstice sunrise. So if you look along that area, that's where the sun rises and then comes across the southern sky and then sets over here. And so for the winter solstice, that's what you would see. If you're for the summer solstice, then you look over here, that's where the sun would rise and then go all the way around. There are also moon ones on here, and we'll talk about the moon ones here in a moment, but that's a different cycle. So moon does the same thing essentially. Now, if you're here on the ground and you were going to look at that, this is a LiDAR profile of Serpent Mound from looking from the west, looking east, across Brush Creek. That's Brush Creek right there. So here's what the alignments kind of look like. There's the summer solstice. There is the equinox, sunrises, both spring and fall, and then there's the winter. Now here are the moon ones. It turns out that you have the minimum northern moon rise, the moon midpoint rises, and the maximum southern moon rise. They also come up inside these coils. And so you have 2 sets of astronomical alignments looking through those coils. Now, there's an interesting key here, and that is, if I went back to that slide here, I put that purple circle there for a reason. That seems to be where most of the astronomical alignments cross, as if there's one single standing point where you could stand to view that. The problem with that is that that point is today off the cliff. Okay? So this is a philosophical question I want you to think about as we're going along here. Why would they take the time to construct Serpent Mound, to have all these astronomical alignments incorporated into its design, but not give themselves the place to stand to see them? All right? So we'll maybe try a crack at answering that. Now, I mentioned that the summer solstice sunset, there was also something else important with that. And this is a much wider LiDAR view, you can barely see Serpent Mound right here, a little squiggle right there. And so the alignment goes off to the horizon in this direction, and you'll see that there's some hills in the distance. Well, the sun comes down along the edge of that hill on the night of the summer solstice. And what that does is it extends the solar time that the sun is above the horizon for a few more seconds longer. This is known to have occurred in astronomical sites, prehistoric astronomical sites around the world. There seems to be something about aligning your view to where the sun comes down in a place where you get a little bit extra view of the sun on that magical moment, all right? Now, 2 years ago, I had the fortunate, the fortune, I guess I should say, of hosting the author Graham Hancock. Anybody know Graham Hancock and his work? Well, Graham Hancock came here, and I helped them to get this photograph with their drone on the summer solstice so that you can see where that comes down in that little notch right there on the horizon. There it is at the moment the sun is touching. You can't see this view from Serpent Mound any longer because the trees have now obscured your view of the horizon. When I first was coming here to do astronomical work, you could see the horizon back, so you can't see that view any longer. You got to get in a drone or a plane to see it. Now, if you want to know what one of these alignments look like, I have done 2 time-lapse films of a couple of them. If you want to show this again to someone else, they're out on YouTube. You can just type in equinox sunrise alignment at Serpent Mound and you'll get this video. But here, we'll play this for you here.
Make sure to subscribe.
No, you don't have to subscribe. So this is from the spring equinox. You'll see here, we're looking in the central coil of Serpent Mound here, and you'll see the sun rise up right through the center. Had to kick that person out of the view there. There it is, sun just rose right there, right in the middle, exactly where it's supposed to be. All right, so that's an alignment. That's what we're talking about. It's a little like watching paint dry. If you come out here and watch it, you know, that's 30 seconds, but that's like a 3-hour long block of time, condensed to 30 seconds, all right? We'll show you one from the summer solstice. I took this year. You'll see a little bit of fog coming here. Again, trees obscuring most of the view, but the sun just peeked out through there, and you'll see it's coming up right through the center here. Again, that's about 4 hours compressed to about 30 seconds. So that's what we're talking about in terms of alignments. Whoops. This is winter solstice sunset through the coil spiral tail there. This was from 2014. I took this one, so that's the most recent one. And that's what we're talking about in terms of alignments. Now, in terms of lunar alignments, these are the ones that Bill Romaine discovered back in the 1980s. Again, minimum northern moon rise, moon midpoint rise, maximum southern moon rise, minimum northern moon set, midpoint moon set, and the maximum southern moon set. Now, the solar alignments happen every single year, right? Because we travel around the sun, we get a summer solstice every year, we get a spring equinox every year, right? But the moon cycles is on a much different time scale. The time it takes for the moon to rise all the way up here until it takes the time for the moon to rise all the way down here is about 18.6 years. Okay? So you're talking about a generation of time to figure out what these alignments are. Hope it's not cloudy the time when you come out there to make your observation, right? So these were calculated out by Romaine once he figured out the true north alignment. Now, if you put them all together, just put them all up here. I think they're going to come all up. So there's a lot going on at Serpent Mound, right? Well, there's one more critical thing, and that's that green line I just put in there, okay? It turns out that back in 2004, when I was here confirming the summer solstice sunset alignment, I noticed that this was our 2004 view. There's the alignment there. It turns out that that exact night after the sunset, about 20 minutes after sunset, I saw this out there. That's Venus. It turns out that Venus was setting on the exact same alignment 1 hour after the sunset on that summer solstice. And it shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was, for the fact that, for the most part, none of the Archeo-Astronomy people or the archaeologists had ever considered that there might be planetary alignments at Serpent Mound. They're still struggling to wrap their head around the fact that there are so many solar and lunar ones, that the fact that there might be planetary ones. But if there are any astronomer students or astronomers in the crowd, you'll figure this out pretty quickly. All of the planets, just like the Earth, go around the sun, right? And so as the sun travels its path across the sky, that is the same path that all of the planets follow. It's called the ecliptic. And so there's this ecliptic path that all of the planets follow, the same as the sun follows, because they're roughly going around the same plane, at least all the visible planets. And so it turns out that wherever you have a solar alignment here at Serpent Mound, you potentially have a planetary alignment of any of the visible planets. So you would have Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Those are generally the 5 acknowledged visible planets, right? It turns out that that night that I made that observation, there was Venus. Mercury was right there, but it's a little less bright, and so in that haze, it was too hard to see. And then Saturn followed about an hour later. So you had Mercury, Venus, and Saturn all setting on the same alignment on the summer solstice within 2 hours of that same alignment. So you have these planetary alignments at Serpent Mound as well. So it turns out that if you were to stand there to view that summer solstice alignment, if you just turned around and looked in the opposite direction, that's where the moonrise was. And so sometimes you get a lunar rise that's happening at the same time. Okay. So we have solar, lunar, and planetary alignments at Serpent Mound. What about celestial alignments? Okay. Well, in 1921, there was a gentleman by the name of George Herbert Cooper who wrote a book called Ancient Britain, the Cradle of Civilization. That's not parochial or anything. And he wrote in a late chapter in the book that many of the earthworks in the Ohio Valley corresponded to constellations in the sky. He didn't elaborate on that except for Serpent Mound. And he drew this picture of Serpent Mound, and the title of the picture was Heavens at Nightfall in January. And that this sky map showed Serpent Mound as a reflection of the constellation of Serpens. And this is his quote: "Here is indisputable proof that the serpent form is taken from the sky and forms part of the ancient sky divinity worship, which includes the solar system as well as the visible constellations." It would have been nice if he had elaborated on any of that, but he didn't. And this really isn't a very good approximation of Serpent Mound, perhaps. But this was kind of discovered or really recognized only in modern times after someone else came up with a different concept. And I'll show you that one here. All right. In the early 1990s, an author by the name of Ross Hamilton wrote a book called The Mystery of Serpent Mound. Was thinking about Serpent Mound one day, and he laid down Bill Romaine's map of Serpent Mound, which he had on a piece of paper, and he laid down a transparency of the constellations of the North Celestial Pole. It's basically of the northern sky. And it just so happened that it kind of fit this grouping of stars. And so he kind of played with it a little bit, and he kind of came to the conclusion that out of all of the stars in this particular constellation, with the exception of this group right here, all of the rest of them seem to lie along the body of Serpent Mound. And that constellation is Draco, which is a circumpolar constellation. It goes around the North Celestial Pole, right? Well, there was one other star that didn't seem to lie along the body, and that was that star right there. And he really was puzzled by that until it turns out that he figured out that that particular star was the exact center point of Serpent Mound. So if you were to measure from that point out to the ends of Serpent Mound, it's equidistant. And it's about 340 feet in either direction. And remember I said about that circle where all of the astronomical alignments seem to cross? That neatly encircles the bowl of the Big Dipper right there on that little map. All right. Now, that star right there, which was in the center point of his, map of the constellations and of Serpent Mound, that star is known as Alpha Draconis. Now, what's important about Alpha Draconis was that when the Egyptians were building the Great Pyramid in Egypt, they named that star Thuban. And that was their most important star in the sky because at that time, that was the North Star in the sky. Today, the North Star is Polaris, right? And the change in the sky over that period of time is due to something that's known as precession of the equinoxes. And I'll get to that here in a moment. But in ancient times, that star would have been the center point of the night sky in which all the stars in the sky rotate around that central point. And it just so happened that that would be the center point of our diagram. All right? So once every 25,890 years or so, the Earth's pole, North Pole and the Southern Pole, point out into space, they kind of trace out an imaginary circle. And along that imaginary circle, there are stars that pass by that central point. Today it's Polaris. In the past, it was Alpha Draconis. Going farther back, it was Vega. Or going forward in time, another 11,000 years or so, we'll hit Vega as the North Star. All right. Now, if we were to look at that in terms of Serpent Mound, that's that northern ecliptic pole, and that's the circle there that our pole then sort of traces out. So there's Polaris today, that's our North Star. There's Thuban way back in the day. So there's, when we apply Serpent Mound to that, that's kind of what we're looking at. Again, here's Romain's Polaris line. This is what Ross calls his Thuban true north line. Because although Romain figured this out in 87, in 1991 or so, Ross figured out that a parallel line, which defines the edge of these two coils of the serpent, goes straight through that center spot where that North Star would have been. Right? And that would have been about 3000 BC or so when that first came into being. Again, about 340 feet in either direction. All right. Now, I mentioned in the past, it was the design of Serpent Mound was such that they built it to have these astronomical alignments, but they didn't give themselves a place to stand to view those alignments. So the question is, why, for one? Second question would be, well, how did they accomplish that if they didn't know where to make the alignments? All right? Well, I think I may have figured out the answer to that second question, which may help us inform us for the first question. And that is, in 1890, in the April 1890 magazine, the archaeologist that excavated at Serpent Mound, Frederick Ward Putnam from the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, wrote the only article that he ever wrote about what he found at Serpent Mound. It was about a 10-page article 2 pages didn't have anything to do with Serpent Mound. So you have about 8 pages that talk about Serpent Mound. And this was his map that he drew of the park, and all the numbers on here are all the things that he found in the park. Okay? So he excavated from 1886 to 1889. Well, I got special researcher access to the Peabody Museum archives a couple years ago, and I came across 2 draft unpublished maps of Serpent Mound that Putnam had done, but they'd never seen the light of day. And I'll show you the first one here. This is the first one. This was made in 1886 before Putnam started his excavation work. And they made this map to show the park boundaries. And then they identified all these things that are written on here. They identified every single tree and what kind of tree was in the park. If there were rocks there, anything physically notable, they put on the map. All right. The second map was done in 1889 after Putnam had done all of his excavations and reconstructions of the mounds. And so you'll see some changes here in the park. And you can see some tears and rips in the map because it was all folded up. Well, I took, this is kind of a comparison of the 2 Serpent Mounds. And you'll see some sort of big changes, or some notable changes anyways. This used to have a feature at the head or at the other end of the oval. That disappeared. And then there were these linear features along the back that subsequently became these circular features, and this one missing on this side. Putnam made some serious changes to the mound when he did his reconstruction work. That's a whole separate talk, but one of the curator that followed Putnam at Harvard, his name was Charles Willoughby, and he wrote, "It is to be noted that the form of the forward portion of the earthwork," that's this whole thing right here, "agrees such closely with the plans of McLean in 1885 and Holmes in 1886, and differs from the model made by Ward," that's Frederick Ward Putnam, for the museum. What Willoughby was saying was that the people who came to Serpent Mound and drew it out before the excavations, this appears to be what was really there. And then after Putnam did his reconstructions, that evaporated. There were changes that were made. And so for all of those people that look at Serpent Mound today and they try to make interpretations of what it looks like today, they don't have all the information, right? So they're having some challenges, when they say, oh, it's a serpent swallowing an egg. Well, that may not be the case, because that may have been a double oval instead. Well, going back to the map, there was one more important find, and that's this. So we're here in the picnic shelter. All those people standing right back there, right behind them is a small mound, okay? That's this mound right here. And that appears to have been at the center of this double dotted line that Putnam drew on his map. Okay? And the only notation that he ever wrote about what is that double dotted line is on this map. He never wrote about it in his article, he never talked about it in any of his notes other than what's on this map. And what's on this map is that right there. The black dots are post holes, or perhaps it says fort holes. It's hard to say. I interpret that to mean that what he found was a double-sectioned grouping of posts, which, if you project that out, kind of looks like that. All right, with that mound at the center. Okay. Now, if we were to take that circle and put on a map of where that is today, we would be inside of that. Now, what is a circle of wooden posts that turns out to be over 300 feet in diameter? Certainly not a building. But what it is, in their examples here, which I'm going to show you, is it appears to be what's known as a wood henge. Okay? And I'll talk about what a wood henge is in a moment. Now, the inner circle is about 307 feet in diameter. The outer circle is about 353 feet in diameter. There have been other wood henges that have been found here in Ohio at prehistoric sites, so this isn't the first. Move on to some examples. The very first one was this one right here. This is at a place called the Stubbs Earthworks. It was discovered by archaeologist Frank Cohen. While he documented it, he didn't discover it. It was actually one of the construction workers who was plowing across this area with his bulldozer, and he noticed a circle, kind of an arc of circles that it turned out to be post holes. And he put a stop to what he was doing and called in some people, and they contacted Frank Cohen, who came out and did some emergency excavations and found this circle of posts, which is 271 feet in diameter, 172 posts. So this would be smaller than the Serpent Mound one, but that was the first one that was found. Interestingly enough, at the Stubbs Earthworks, the reason that construction was happening was they were building a high school there in, I think it was Miami Township or something like that, it's not too far from the Miami River, about 5 miles south of Fort Ancient. And as part of the earthwork complex there was a Serpent Mound there, which was destroyed back in the 1970s. Gravel company mined it away for gravel. Another post circle was found inside of the walls at Fort Ancient. That was discovered by archaeologist Jared Burks in 2005. That's about 200 feet in diameter, approximately 200 posts. Appears to be aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. This earthwork here, this was another magnetometer survey, which was done by Jennifer Pedersen Weinberger, who worked for the National Park Service. This is at the Hopewell Earthworks. That's 375 feet in diameter, 108 posts. And that appears to be aligned to the summer solstice sunrise in this direction, winter solstice sunrise in that direction. And you can see the post circle there, or the posts here. This is a ditch outside of the post circle. That is not the largest Hopewell wooden post circle found. Most recent was found just last year at this site here at the Hopeton Earthworks. The Hopeton Earthworks is this really, really large earthwork circle that kind of intersects with this sort of rounded edged square. This circle is 1,054 feet in diameter, and it turns out that this is a magnetometer survey that was done by the German Archaeological Institute in cooperation with the National Park Service, and they found that ringing this entire circle were a series of posts, one spaced out every 20 feet. So this turns out to be the world's largest known wood henge in the entire world in the prehistoric times. And this is an excavation hole. They excavated one of the post holes. You can kind of see that there. That's a huge meter stick there. And so that's the most recently found one. So it appears that many of the prehistoric sites here in Ohio had these wood henges. They appear to have been used for the sighting of the rising of the sun and the moon during the calendar year, or over the long period of time for the moon cycle, 18.6 years. And so this is how they made the observations. So it wouldn't be too surprising to find a wood henge here, and then they would just make those observations here, and then just build the earthwork right over there where they knew what the observations were, right? Just a couple hundred yards away. Okay, so there's our post circle, right? Now, this is the area that we're talking about. It does not show up on LiDAR. It doesn't show up on a magnetometer. Jared Burks did a magnetometer survey of this area around the picnic shelter and did not find any post holes. But that's not the be-all and end-all of the surveying, because in the early 1990s, there was an excavation that was done along that fence line out there. They installed a water line for a drinking fountain right out here. And when they did that excavation, if I go back here. That excavation ran along here and ran right next to this mound and then over this direction. And as they crossed exactly where the wood henge would have been, they discovered post holes. But they didn't know that this was in existence then. So they don't really know what those post holes were. The archaeologists that did that work for the Ohio Historical Society at the time never wrote a report about any of the excavations, and so they didn't really document much of it. The only documentation occurred from the historian Stephen Kelly, who was the late Stephen Kelly, who was a historian here in Adams County. He took pictures of some of the excavations and wrote about it and interviewed the archaeologists, and that's the only documentation that they found those post holes. Now, why couldn't they have found any magnetometer, evidence? Well, it turns out that the whole area up here, back in the early part of the 1900s and the late 1800s, was a working farm. There were multiple buildings up here, barn and all kinds of working buildings for a farm, and so this whole area was just all torn up. And so it's hard to find anything out here around this picnic shelter. All right, so if you were to take this double circle here and just transport it right there so that the center of it was right where all of those astronomical alignments cross, you turn out to be right at the center of where that appears to define the exact curvature of Serpent Mound. Right? And so I believe that's how they made the observations. They made all the observations at the wood henge here, and then took those observations and moved it right over here to construct Serpent Mound along that same curvature. So this is another view of it, kind of looking at those. This is the equinox, sunrise, summer solstice, winter solstice. One last look. All right, nearing the home stretch here. Okay, so why would these ancient people do such a thing? Well, to understand that, we have to know a little bit about their beliefs, and that is definitely challenging because modern Indian tribes really have a broken cultural link to the ancient past. The genocide that took place in the 16 and 1700s with Europeans coming here and displacing most of the indigenous people, moving them physically out there or wholesale killing them, was an incomprehensible tragedy. And part of it was the loss of the memory that they had of the ancient times. Well, some of the tribes have retained bits of that memory, and so we can kind of begin to construct a little picture of what things might have been like in the distant past. And one of the things that we need to understand is something that is known as quartering time and space. So think about, they call in the so-called four directions, right? So they've quartered the whole world into these four directions. But one of the things that they say is that a viewer who observes an equinox or a solstice is said to become the cosmic center of the universe, pinning the sky and the earth together with the four directions. So if you're lucky enough to watch one of those summer solstice alignments or equinox alignments, you are reenacting the first moment of creation. You are pinning the earth and the sky together, all right? And that precise point in time, the original Native American term has been translated as a singularity, okay? A singular moment in time. Now, one of the things that Native American cultures would say about a sacred site, a ceremonial site such as Serpent Mound, is that if you were to think about Serpent Mound as simply a calendar, that it marks out certain times during the year, that was a function of the site, and that was considered to be profane. You didn't use the site for that. It was just considered to be a part of it. But what was more important was its purpose. So there's a difference between function and purpose. Sometimes they're the same, but a lot of times they're different, particularly in Native American culture. And so having a mound site or a medicine wheel as a calendar site, that would be profane. But if your purpose was to maintain universal order, that would be profound. And I think that's what's going on here, all right? So this is quartering time and space. You have the plane of our existence in Native American cosmology. We live on the earth. This is our plane of existence. Then there is what's known as the upper sky world. Well, that's just the path of the sun, which is kind of ruled by the thunderbirds. And then you have the underworld, which is ruled by either what's known as the great horned serpent. In some tribes, they know it as the underwater panther. But essentially, it's the same concept. And that these things are connected through what's known as an axis mundi, or in some cases, the world tree. And so they sort of envisioned a tree reaching up into the sky and down into the earth to connect those two places. Now, the great horned serpent and the thunderbirds are connected in Native American mythology in a very unique way, because they're at each other's throats. Okay? The tribal lore around great horned serpents and thunderbirds has been fairly well documented over the last century or so. And in some of the mythologies, they talk about that the thunderbirds would start off in the northwest in the spring and move southeast later in the summer in their quest to kill the great horned serpent. And the way that they would kill the great horned serpent would be to shoot their fiery arrows through the head of the serpent. If they can do that, the world is renewed for another year. It has to happen, or the world ceases to exist. Okay? And so these traditions, there are certain ceremonies and rituals that involve reenacting this thunderbird great horned serpent cosmology. Now, so this is like an earth renewal ritual. Right? This, by the way, was found just outside Cincinnati at the Turner Earthworks. This is made out of mica with an inlaid pearl eye. This one here shows the great horned serpent with its bending body facing off against the thunderbird there. All right, now, in the various cosmologies of the Native Americans, the one that seems to have retained the most sky knowledge are the Lakota. And they would tell you that they believe that their tribes in ancient times came from this area and that they migrated to their present whereabouts in North and South Dakota area since about 1700s, but that they originally kind of came from this area. And so it's important to understand perhaps what they believe the sky looked like. Because if you remember what Ross Hamilton said, he talked about those stars were laid out like the constellation of Draco. Well, Draco is a Greek constellation from the Old World. Native Americans didn't have Greek constellations. They didn't draw the same patterns in the sky that the Europeans drew. They connected the patterns of the stars in their own way and attached their own mythologies to that. So it would be important to understand what that grouping of stars is in their tradition, okay? Now this is from the Skitty Pawnee in that area. This is called the Big Black Meteoric Star Bundle. And this is an example of their star knowledge. This was documented by Vondel Chamberlain in a book called When the Stars Came Down to Earth, the Cosmology of the Skitty Pawnee, back in 1982. And there's a quote in here, it says, "The most important were the star gods who at the discretion of Tirawaha planned and carried out the creation of the earth and the people. 4 of her assistants, lightning, thunder, wind, and clouds, actually carried out the original creation of life and renewed it each year. They were the gods of the weather as well as life. Thunder, the voice of the mysterious being, was one of the most important elements of Skythi mythology and used in conjunction with the observations of stars to set the calendar. Okay? So, in the 1980s, after Vondel Chamberlain did his ethnographic work, the Lakota then put together a star chart, and this is from the Lakota by the name of Ronald Goodman in 1992. This was published, called Lakota Star Knowledge. And that grouping of stars, which we know as Draco in the Greek constellations, the Lakota identified that as the Thunderbird. Now, why would that be important? So here we have Serpent Mound, right? It's laid out what appears to be like the great horned serpent of that ancient mythology, right? But it's a kind of a raised earth effigy figure. But it's laid out like a constellation, which to the Pawnee and to the Lakota is the Thunderbird. So what I believe is going on at Serpent Mound is that you have all these astronomical alignments which allow people to view that moment of creation, whether it's at the moment of the equinox or the moment of the solstices. And what happens is that the sky and the underworld come together on our plane of existence. And it's the fusion, Serpent Mound is the fusion of that sky and the underworld together into one singular being that allowed people to be able to communicate to both those ancient cosmological worlds of the sky and the underworld. And that kind of gives us that understanding of the quartering of time and space. So Serpent Mound's function may have been to mark the movements of celestial objects, but that's not its purpose. Right? The purpose was a place meant for people to communicate with those supernatural beings and to interact with those planes of reality. So I hope someday we'll be able to reconstruct the Woodhenge here like they reconstructed the Woodhenge at Cahokia many years ago. And with that, I thank you very much.